So if I was going to sum up the book in just one sentence, it would be that generational thinking is an incredibly powerful idea that has been horribly corrupted by terrible myths, stereotypes, and cliches. Because when you look back at the academic thinking on generations, it brings in some of the biggest thinkers that we've ever had in philosophy or sociology. People like the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who said that we should not hide the fact that our social progress rests essentially upon death, which I realise is not a very cheery thought for a Sunday morning, but what he meant was that we get quite stuck in our ways once we get past a certain age, and we need new generations to come in to keep us fresh. So the successive steps of humanity necessarily require a continuous renovation from one generation to the next. So these are really big ideas of life, death, and social progress. So it's a real shame for me as a generational specialist to see that the type of generational analysis we tend to get today is more things like this. Millennials are killing the napkin industry. So I'm just going to do a quick show of hands. See who's a millennial in the house. It's 1980 to 1996. Hands up if you're a millennial. So lots of millennials, that's good. You should be ashamed of yourselves, millennials, for killing the napkin industry. In fact, we could fill this whole next session on just things you're supposed to have killed. But it's not just millennials that get picked on generationally. Any baby boomers in the room today? Baby boomers 1945 to 1965. Oh yes, we've got a fair smattering of baby boomers. Well, baby boomers don't get accused of killing things so much as ruining things. In this case, this is an Atlantic article, in this case, ruining everything. So well done, baby boomers, for that. So this is kind of a theme in generational analysis. We unthinkingly often encourage generational conflict, pitting one generation against the other. And you can see that on really big things, big issues like climate change. So when Greta Thunberg was made Person of the Year by Time magazine, they called her a standard bearer in a generational battle between old and young. The US singer, Billie Eilish, was much more direct. She said, hopefully the adults and the old people start listening to us about climate change. Old people are going to die and don't really care if we die, but we don't want to die yet, said Billie. Now, I love Billie Eilish, and my daughters love Billie Eilish even more. She's a genius in many ways, but you'd have to agree that's quite an extreme representation of old people's views of younger people. And not only that, it's just not true in terms of climate. There is no real generational break in concern about the environment. This is the proportion of American adults who think the rise in world temperature caused by greenhouse effects is extremely or very dangerous. And what I do in the book a lot is just plot the 5 different generations that we see in lots of the commentary over time. And you can see there's a bit of a difference between generations on this, but it's a few percentage points. Nothing like the rhetoric around generational division on this would lead you to believe. And it's even worse than that. When you look at lots of other behaviors, things like whether you boycott products for environmental or social purpose reasons, it's actually older generations more likely to do that than younger generations because they're a bit richer and they can afford to make those sorts of choices. So this is not just wrong, it's dangerous, I think, because if there's one thing we need people to come together on, it's things like climate change. We're artificially dividing people on these sorts of big issues when it's not actually true. The other thing that comes up a lot about generations is a culture war, I suppose culture war between snowflakes, a new generation of snowflakes or social justice warriors, and older people. And this is another misdirection or myth, but it's slightly different because there are differences. Young and old are different on attitudes to race, immigration, gender equality, gender identity, all those types of things. But the key point here is that's always been the case. That is always the case. It's always the case that the young, when I look back over decades of similar sorts of data, the young are always about twice as likely to be comfortable with the most emerging, changing social norm than the older generation. You can see that in all sorts of different ways. So just take an example. If you go back to the mid-1980s, when baby boomers were actually the younger adult generation at that time, they were half as likely as the pre-1945 generation to think women should stay at home and men should go out and go to work than their parents and grandparents at that time. But then if you roll forward to 2021, and now baby boomers are among the oldest adult generation, Gen Z, a new generation, and you change the issue to something like being proud or ashamed of the British Empire, and Gen Z are half as likely to be proud of the British Empire than baby boomers, the older generation. So the issues change, but the ratio, the proportions between young and old stay more or less the same. So we haven't got this new trend of big gaps on social issues between young and old. It's just that the issues have changed. But these gaps between young and old on these types of attitudes leads to one quite constant of history. We always think today's young are uniquely wrong or weird. And you can go to any era in history, all the way back to Socrates in 400 BC, in a very, very long diatribe against young people of his day. He said, the children now love luxury, they have bad manners, they show disrespect for their elders, and love gossip in the place of activity, said Socrates back then. And it could apply today. In fact, we did a poll of the general public today, and over half of the public agree about that's the case for young people today. So this is like constant throughout time. But I like this one. You can go to any era. This is 1771, a letter in Town and Country magazine. He called the young people of that day a race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles, which is a great, great phrase, and more or less a definition of snowflake just 250 years before we had that as a term. So I think we can agree that it feels more divided between age groups now, by generations now. And there's lots of reasons for that. I think there's two main ones. One I'm not going to say much about, which is the more fractious media, social media and politics that we have right now. So I looked at that more in my first book on people's misperceptions and where they come from. But I think there's another very important trend that's been less noticed and less commented on, which is what some American academics call a dangerous experiment in age segregation, where we are just living much more separately by age groups now than we have at any point in human history. And it's true in the US, but there is the same sort of trend in the UK. So this is the old age dependency ratio, basically the proportion of retirement age people to young people, pre-retirement age people in different types of settlements in the UK. This is UK data, from villages, small villages, all the way up through larger towns, up to the biggest cities, core cities. And you can see up till 1991 from the census, there was really no difference between the age profile of these different types of areas. We were kind of all mixed up, whether it was a village or a city. But since then, we've had this enormous splaying apart, where towns and villages are getting older and cities and large towns are getting younger to quite a big degree. These are big shifts in demographics. So we are living much more separately than we did in the past. And I'd say there's a second element to this. Our digital lives have become much more important to us. We spend more time online, doing different sorts of things, and we're doing that very separately. This is a proportion of French adults. The book's international, so it looks across different sorts of countries. This is a proportion of French adults using social online networks every day. And we've got a kind of sense that older people are more online than they were in the past, and there's not so much difference, but that's not really true. Still, the biggest generational gaps that I see in the book are on technological types of behaviors. So we can see here, nearly every Gen Z is on social networks every day, 9 in 10 of them. Then quite a big step down to millennials, quite different behaviors among millennials. Bigger step down to Gen X, my generation, and then baby boomers and pre-war generation, very few of them on social networks. So we're doing different things to different intensities on different platforms online. So we've got this separation in physical, where we live, in terms of how we run into each other, but also then in terms of our digital lives. So massive gaps between young and old in terms of their behaviors online, massive separation between young and old in terms of where they live, increasing separation between where they live. And that separation fuels stereotyping. When you're not in contact with people, you start to make assumptions about them. And some of that is good fun, just good fun. Have people seen this? A Facebook group, a group where we all pretend to be boomers. Anyone seen it? Been on it? No, not so much now. That's interesting. It's really worth a look. It was set up by two 20-year-old Americans, and the only rule is you have to post as if you're a baby boomer. So it's young people doing it, but you have to post as if you're a baby boomer, which basically means you don't know the rules of social media. That's the kind of theme of it. And you get some great stuff on there. You get these capitalized political rants My grandson forgot to call me on my birthday. Thanks, Obama. It's really disgusting medical queries from people. But it's these ones that always really make me laugh the most, and I think it says more about me than it does about them. It's people putting really sad messages on inappropriate backgrounds when not. So it's really worth a look. It's good fun. It's good fun. The interesting thing is, in interviews with the moderators and people who set this up, they have to moderate it very carefully because it quickly tips into really racist or other tropes about older people. So it's even in this kind of space where it's just good fun, that separation does have these downsides in separating. But in these types of divisions between the generations, supposed divisions between the generations, are a real distraction from what is truly different generationally, which in many ways are economic. We've had an extraordinary concentration of wealth by generation. And you can see that across lots of different countries. I'll just show you one example from the US again. This is the share of national wealth owned by each generation by their median cohort age, by the average age of each of the cohorts. So you can compare them at the same age, which is really important because you do build up wealth as you get older. And you can see this baby boomers racing away, this huge gap. So at an average age of 45, my generation, Generation X, had about 15% of the US national wealth. At the same age, baby boomers had 42% of the national wealth in the US. Huge concentration. So all those baby boomers put their hands up earlier, they're the rich ones. If you want to go and get a drink at the break, tap those people up. But this is an enormous change in society. And it's true across the world, and a lot of it is driven by house prices, asset prices more generally, and the extraordinary change in home ownership levels. Just taking Britain as an example here, pre-war generation and the baby boomers followed an incredibly similar path, ending up about 8 and 10 owning their own home. My generation, Generation X, looked like we were racing up to meet them, then just got deflected away by the huge house price rises in the early 2000s and then the financial crash that followed it. And poor millennials never really got started on this. It's gone up a bit now, it's about 50%, but it's still so much lower than before. But it's worse than that. Not only do they have lower home ownership levels, they get blamed for it. And you may have seen this a couple of years ago. Kirsty Allsop really did create a Twitter storm because her basic point was it was millennials' own fault. It was their going abroad, EasyJet, coffee, gym, Netflix lifestyle is stopping them owning their own home. Nothing to do with a huge increase in house prices or wage stagnation, just this. But I'm much more with Matt Zarb-Cousins, who's a journalist who said, to be fair to Kirsty Allsop, if you cancelled your Netflix and Pure Gym subscription, instead save that £40 a month, as long as the housing market doesn't go up at all, then in just 54 years, you will have enough for the deposit on an average house, which does point to the ridiculousness of that. So, to sum up from my perspective, I guess my view of generational thinking is that it's really powerful. I agree with Comte. We need to understand how generations are changing if we want to understand not just where we've come from and now, but understand the future. Because if there are differences between generations, that helps you predict the future. So what we need to do is ditch the misuse of the labels, but keep that bigger thinking of generational change. Because when you're born does shape who you are as an individual, it does affect you, and it does shape society. Generational change does shape society. It's just that we need to ignore most of the generational analysis that you'll see, that fake conflict and almost horoscopes. It's like star signs. Generational labels have turned into star signs. We need to ignore and ditch most of that, but keep the big thinking. And it's so infused into our media environment and everywhere else. The Wall Street Journal did a check of LinkedIn, and there's actually 400 consultants on LinkedIn who actually call themselves just millennial consultants. So they're consulting on swathes of tens of millions of the population, saying that they've got particular insight into them. So try to ignore that. But I realize my kind of rosy view of generations is a bit based on the fact that I'm Generation X. And no one ever talks about us. It's always millennials or baby boomers or now Gen Z. So I'm very much with Jonathan Walker, who says I'm neither a millennial nor a boomer. I come from a generation so irrelevant that people can't even be bothered to hate us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and
No
thank you
worries.
for starting us off. So, just a quick question. I mean, it struck me. So, the thing about all the stuff that you talk about, the labels and all that sort of jazz, it is entertaining, and it is obviously, and I assume that for the mainstream media or any media really, that they're very click-friendly things to be able to blame all our problems on boomers or millennials or whoever sort of thing, right? Yeah. And whereas the other, oh, fabulous, great.
Yep. Yep.
Now, if you could redo your talk, then that would be for the recording. Sorry, is the stuff you showed at the end is massively important, right? And it actually explains a lot of perhaps a lot of the problems, a lot of the anger that we see, perhaps, in at least some of it. Not I'm going to say all of it. But I guess it's it almost made me. I'm wondering, is it just not interesting enough to talk about the actual big generation gaps that you've identified?
Yeah, I mean, the labels are incredibly, as you say, incredibly attractive. They're so snappy. Headline writers and social media, and when you're using it on social media, people have an image of that immediately. So that is catnip to editors and sub-editors, because they just love having that summing up where we've got this mental image of things. And there's a big discussion in the US about trying to get proper research organizations like Pew Research to ditch them entirely, not use them, because it's fueling this sense. And so yes, I think there is a distraction element to this, but it's not confined to this generational aspect of it. We are quite often distracted from big economic trends by things like culture wars more generally. In my day job for King's College, we've got a big series of studies on culture wars. Are they real? What's driving it? All those types of things. And that is often a political tactic to distract people from big economic trends, or to try to bring people towards you by simplifying things into these tribal identities that you're either on this side, or you're a millennial, or you're a Gen Z, all of those types of simplifying things. I mean, I would be, just an encouraging word on that is our latest research on those types of things shows that people don't really buy it. They're much more nuanced in their perspectives on culture war type issues than you would often hear. And they're much more caring up and down the generations than the kind of conflict narrative that you get in social media and the media. So the public are much more sensible on this than you see, even though they're being fed quite a lot of this thing that's trying to divide us or create this kind of narrative that distracts us from the big trends.
Right. Okay. So you're a sort of public policy expert, just generally, right? So I mean, looking at those final charts that you show about, the massive wealth gap sort of thing. I mean, what do we do to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest trends that we're going to face over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So the big trend, economic trend that we've had for the last 30 or 40 years has been the increase in private wealth. Through house prices, through asset bubbles, through pension valuations, those types of things. That's been the big trend. But within that, the big trend it's been concentrated within a particular cohort. But then within that, it's been concentrated within a particular proportion of that cohort, the baby boomers. Not every baby boomer made it big, clearly. So it's the top third of baby boomers have the vast majority of that wealth.
Right.
So what happens next is the biggest challenge that we're going to face, because they're going to die out. The wealth is going to flow down, but very unevenly to the next generation. And this is our biggest worry, is that some people are set to inherit an awful lot of money that flows down. Others are not going to get anything. And that divides us. So in the US, there's a lot of discussion of the end of the American dream, and where you start is where you finish, because wealth accumulation has become so important. So I think for us, from a policy point of view, we do need to engage with wealth, private wealth. How do you tax it? All of those types of things, because we've not been in this situation before. And it is a new thing for us, and people do not like wealth taxation. But if we don't kind of address that, I think we'll be in trouble with some people having no chance in life and some people having much easier chance in life, and that's not good.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is, I'm sure their entire conference is run on this topic, but it just seems weird to me, though, that this topic that you mentioned about this wealth and income inequality no one really talks about it, other than primarily academics and economists, I would say. It never seems to ever leak out into the wider press.
It's really interesting. I think we have become much more individualized over the last few decades, where people think it's down to them to succeed or fail. And that's like a cultural trend that's been reinforced through politics and economics about actually, there's no one there to help you. You're on your own, or it's your family's kind of support. And that's well studied, and we can well see that. So it is difficult to get that across. I mean, in my day job, we do a lot on the politics side, and there are people that are really interested in this, in politics. So we help feed into the all-party parliamentary group on inclusive growth, which is about how do you deal with this sense of inequality, and it's all about equality of opportunity in the end, because it's increasingly the case that we don't have a level playing field because of these types of trends. So there is engagement in this in a kind of policy and politics kind of sense, but it is a difficult thing to get headlines and get people engaged in, because we're fighting against those big trends where everyone thinks. And one of the just quick anecdote on that is that when we ask that question about is it millennials and Gen Z's own fault that they don't own their own home, not only do over half of the public agree, over half of Gen Z and millennials agree. So they're blaming themselves for this change in context. Wow. So we've internalized this sense of actually it's our fault that we haven't succeeded, when the real reason is house prices have gone up by many multiples more than wages have gone up.
Okay, and I don't think, but assuming that there is possibly a change in government coming in the next year, is that something that will this new group, do you have any sense if they have any greater sensitivity to these issues?
Yeah, they do, I think. I mean, it is just, that is the political difference between Conservative and Labour. They do have a more, we talk about it as individualistic and structuralist perspective. So you either think everything's down to the individual, or you think everything is down to the structures around them that help them or hold them back. Yeah. And it's not that it's completely opposite sides from Labour to Conservative. There's always a mix between those two sides of things. But they're more on that structuralist side of things to think, actually, we need to change the environment. That is true. The challenge they'll have is all the forces working against them, global economy not doing great, public finances not doing great. They're not going to have an awful lot of space to play with, and that is going to be tricky for them to actually change things, because I didn't get to show you lots more of the generational book analysis, which is we've lost a lot of faith in the future, we've got a real strong connection to thinking that the next generation will have a better life than the current one. As parents and grandparents, you really want to see your kids and grandkids do better than you, and that's getting really hard to achieve when there's no growth, no economic growth, and all those types of things. So that's going to be, again, they're going to have just these big challenges. Can we address that? There is hope in things like AI and fourth industrial revolution. All those types of things could well make a step change. So you've got to have some level of hope, but there's going to be lots of headwinds as well.
Bobby, thank you so much.
No worries.
Great to see you.
Thanks, Herb. Thanks, sir.